Hello and welcome to this panel discussion on land. The past few months have shown just how important home is, and yet more than 8 million people are still living in unaffordable or unsuitable housing in England. So how do we change this? Network Homes' report entitled Making Land Deliver offers some answers on how to reform land policy and make housing affordable again. It is very timely, given Boris Johnson's new promise of the biggest planning shake-up since World War II, which may come this month in the planning policy paper. Today, we will hear more about the findings of the Network Homes report. I am Martina Lees, a senior property writer for The Times and Sunday Times, and I will be chairing this panel discussion. If you would like to tweet about the session, the hashtag to use is Making Land Deliver. You can ask questions throughout the discussion. Just use the Q&A button at the bottom of the screen. So with us today to talk about the report is the man who wrote it. Reuben Young is a research and policy manager at Network Homes and co-author of Making Land Deliver. He also recently co-wrote Homes for Heroes, the paper launching the G15 initiated campaign for key worker housing post-COVID. Prior to joining Network Homes 2 years ago, Reuben was a researcher for Peabody, where he published research papers on housing mobility in social housing and on the poverty trap of higher rents. In his spare time, he runs the campaign group Priced Out, which campaigns for lower housing costs and more house building. Also with us is Rose Grayston. She co-founded On Place Ltd, which is working with the Create Streets Commission into left behind areas. They aim to make the levelling up agenda meaningful in the light of COVID-19. Previously, Rose worked with Cllr, where she led work on land policy reform. That included the charity's viability loophole campaign to influence the government's revised NPPF 2 years ago. And then Rico Wojtulewicz is head of housing policy at the House Builder Association, which represents the interests of smaller house builders. He has extensive knowledge and insight into the way land and planning policy affects the 99% of housing developers who aren't the ones at the top of the oligopoly. And then lastly, we have Shama Tatler. She is a Labour councillor for Brent and the lead member for Regeneration, Property and Planning. This year, Shama's borough has more affordable homes in construction starts than any other London borough. As part of her role, she leads some of the largest regeneration projects in London, such as the Wembley Park area, and the multi-award-winning estate regeneration scheme in South Kilburn, where residents last year overwhelmingly voted to continue the work. So, first of all, we will hear more from Reuben on what the report says.
Thanks very much, Martina, and thanks everyone for joining us. So land is a fundamental building block of new homes, and it's a fundamental aspect of our whole housing crisis. The high cost of developable land is a symptom and a cause of how high housing costs we face in all areas of highest demand around the country. It's a symptom because the extortionately high private rents and house prices in London, for example, are a result of the location, aka the land, being sought after by more people than there are available homes to move into in London. In the current paradigm, at least, land for housing is rationed by the planning system, so homes can't be built at a rate that meets the demand for the location, aka the land. So unmet demand for housing increases the cost of land. It's also a cause of the housing crisis because high land costs make building affordable housing very difficult indeed. Developers of affordable homes like housing associations struggle to pay for the land to build homes that could house some of the 8.5 million people living in unstable or unsuitable accommodation around the country. Areas of highest unaffordability, the areas where we most need sub-market housing, are often the very places it's hardest to build it because of high land costs. So the cost of land increases the unmet demand for housing. So we have unmet demand for housing increasing the cost of land, and the cost of land increasing further the unmet demand for housing. So we have this terrible feedback loop that makes the areas of high demand just more and more unaffordable for people to live in. Despite the housing crisis, we need some way of breaking this loop. So we can build more homes so that housing costs come down for everyone, and we can build more affordable homes so that costs come down for the households moving into them and everyone else too. But it's just like building market housing, building social housing brings down rents and prices for everyone. So we at the network have a 3-point plan for government to do exactly that, to break this loop and get more homes and more affordable homes built. Firstly, we need to allow public bodies like Homes England and the Grayston Authority to compulsorily purchase land a lot more cheaply. So part of the reason land is so expensive is speculation, right? Because of the scarcity of land for housing, landowners expect land values to rise, and so they don't want to part with their land, even if its present use doesn't bring them much income. If public bodies like the GLA could compulsorily purchase it more cheaply than they can now, this would deter speculation, because landowners would know they may not be able to wait for the housing crisis to make them even more money. And when these powers are actually used, which probably needn't be very often, they could find land for housing that may not be have been possible before. For example, if you have a load of land that needs assembling with very fragmented ownership, the private sector might not want to go near it. That's point one. Point two is account for social value when selling public land. So currently when central or local government or NHS trusts or TfL or anyone like that sells land, they tend to require a market value for it. But if they sell to a developer who wants to provide more affordable homes there, that needs to be considered too. Martina mentioned Homes for Heroes in the introduction, which is our campaign for building key worker housing. That would be a great place to start here. Imagine if all NHS trusts, all of their land near hospitals was reserved for affordable housing for NHS staff. We wouldn't be facing the impending crisis of over half of nurses saying they want to leave London because of the cost of living, at a time when there are already 10,000 vacancies. That's number two. Number three is reforming developer contributions to affordable housing. So we shouldn't just rely on public grants to build affordable homes. Developers and landowners who've profited enormously from the housing crisis need to pay their fair share as well. And the current way we do this, which is Section 106 agreements and the community infrastructure levy, they give a lot of scope for gaming the system and providing a lot less affordable housing than local councils may want to. And if land delivers less affordable housing, its cost increases again because the amount developers are prepared to pay for it increase. So we think we should roll the affordable housing component of Section 106 and Cllr into a flat tax on the total value of the development. In our report, we set out a way we can do this that creates certainty for councils, certainty for developers, flexibility for councils, and would deliver a lot more affordable homes for those in housing need than our present system. If we take these three steps, the price of land will fall and more desperately needed homes for sub-market rents could be built. And perhaps most appealingly, these policies would amount to essentially a transfer of wealth from landowners who generally didn't earn their money because it's to do with public investment and jobs around the land they own, and they generally don't need the money. And it would transfer that wealth to those most in need via lower housing costs. So we think this is a great idea.
Thanks, Reuben. So I'd like to hear from each of the speakers briefly. What are your thoughts? So shall we start with Rose?
Hi. So firstly, I'd just like to say thank you so much to Reuben and to Network Homes for producing this report. As someone that's been campaigning on housing, on land reform, on planning reform for many years, I really can't tell you how helpful and how important it is to have evidence and perspectives like this from social housing providers, from the people who are actually getting the homes built. This report follows on the heels of another Network Homes report last year on why housing associations find it so tough to build social rent. that provided, you know, just reams of really fantastic evidence for those of us who are campaigning on social housing grants to use. And I really hope and think this will do the same for land and planning reform. So, you know, please do keep producing these great reports. I say to others in the sector, please think about how you can do the same. You guys have the experience of what makes it so tough to build the homes we need on the ground, and that experience is vital to everybody else who's involved in this campaign to get positive reform. I'd absolutely back the thrust of this report's recommendations. I think they're exactly the right place to be looking. Measures we can use to increase access to private land for social rent housing and other types of affordable homes. Public land, of course, you know, this land is ours. Let's figure out a way that we can start using it better to meet social needs. At the moment, we're using public land to do private land's job really badly. You know, let's do something else with this land. It comes from a different source. We can do something better with it. And the very vexed question of Section 106, a developer contribution system. You know, it's a deeply imperfect system, Section 106, and I think there's so much scope for improvement. I do have a lot of questions about how Network Home's proposal would work in practice, particularly, you know, sort of relies on the fungibility of housing, the idea that we can sort of substitute a market sale home for a social rent or a shared ownership one really easily. And in my experience, that's not necessarily the case. I think this is really important that we think about at the moment as well. We've got a lot of suggestions out there at the moment about using public money to buy market sale homes and flip them to affordable tenures. And I just flag that when the UK has done this in the past, we've ended up with a lot of social rent and other homes that are the wrong size in the wrong places, that just aren't the right homes for the jobs they need to do. So, you know, I'd absolutely support the recommendations here, but I'm definitely looking forward to giving some views on how we could tweak them to be as effective as possible.
Shama, so what have you seen from a government point of view?
So yeah, thank you very much, and I'm really excited to be part of this conversation, really. And I think part of my role as Regen and Property and Planning Lead is to look at how we maximise public assets to deliver housing, but also infrastructure. And I think that's part of the really important conversation, that if we have housing, we need the associated infrastructure to go with it. So transport and obviously social infrastructure like medical centres, schools, etc. So I think any direction or any support that allows public sector bodies like local councils to be able to purchase land through a CPO system is brilliant. We need to make the system more effective, and quicker. I think we need to look at what the current barriers are in the system to stop that happening. In Brent, for example, we use CPOs on our estate regen schemes, our own schemes, but that's small leaseholders where we enact CPOs, and that can take up to 2 years. The process can take up to 2 years from start to finish. And we support, you know, when developers are coming in with a bigger scheme, we've underwritten CPOs to enable that development to go forward. So I think there's an element of how we use CPOs and make it more effective and make it more efficient. I think the current system is much too slow and much too laborious on getting, and if we really are serious about driving affordable housing delivery, that really needs to be looked at. In terms of the Section 106 and Cllr and the developer contributions, I think the current system is not perfect by any means at all. I think we have to look at what does Section 106 and Cllr deliver alongside the affordable housing. So in Brent, we do use a lot of Section 106 obligations to deliver employment outcomes for residents, as well as obviously transport infrastructure and other infrastructures needed. So my view would be that if we look at reforming Section 106 and Cllr, how would we deliver infrastructure that's needed and all the other things that come with Section 106? So I think a radical idea could be about combining it and actually ring fencing potentially some for infrastructure, some for housing. But I think the thrust of the argument is about making sure that public sector bodies have access to public land and keep it public. I think that's for me a priority. In Brent, we don't sell our land, or we don't generally look at disposing of our own land. It's very rare that we do. And actually what I would love to see come forward is if public bodies like Network Rail, TfL and various others particularly across London, have housing targets. Why is there not a conversation around partnership with local authorities or housing associations to deliver an entire scheme, as opposed to a percentage of a private development that TfL, whoever are doing their car parks and so on. So I think there's a way to go in terms of public sector bodies working together better in order to make sure that the land stays public and the asset stays public. So I'll leave it at that, and I'm happy to kind of add more questions there, but I know we've got an hour here to go.
Rico, what do you make of the report, just initially from a house builder point of view?
Yeah, I think the report is really valuable in terms of understanding the nuance of the house building industry. One of the things that we typically think about are piecemeal solutions, and being in this job now for almost 6 years, trying to just discuss certainty is so difficult. As we saw last week, people were talking about deregulation of the planning system. Nobody, very few people have actually asked for deregulation. What they want is more certainty on site. But just to get anybody within the housing industry that are reporters to mention that can be very difficult. And this report tackles some of the more complicated issues. And what it does is it allows us a broader understanding of the issues and a route into conversations. You know, when we talk about Section 106, you know, it automatically gives me an opportunity to bring up the money that's not been spent by local authorities. You know, I spent the last 3 years campaigning for transparency around Section 106, because actually it's very difficult to understand what a council has brought in and what they're spending. You take someone like the City of London, which has delivered 0 council or social houses in the last however long, especially last year. They've got £120 million from developers sitting there doing nothing. And when we start deconstructing what money has actually gone into the system via developments and via private developers, actually I think this allows us a better opportunity to understand what we can take out of it. And that's what this report does, is it allows us to more clearly think about the challenges we face, whether that be specific London challenges, which are very different from the rest of the UK, whether it be use of land or getting land out there, for example, building on the green belt, which we would have to do to deliver social homes, but actually unpacking exactly what challenges local authorities have that aren't just about funding. They might be about maintenance, about management. And that's why I've always liked a lot of Reuben's work, because he does think more deeply about what the challenges are. It doesn't stick to the perhaps regurgitated narrative that we see. It's one of the reasons I love my job, is because I get to really annoy people by having these more difficult conversations, especially ministers. And it's nice to, you know, put the cat amongst the pigeons. I think that's the only way we're going to solve the housing crisis. Difficult conversations that move outside our sphere.
Thank you, Rico. So let's talk through the recommendations of the report. So the first one, which arguably might be the most controversial one, is about allowing local councils, public bodies like Homes England and the Greater London Authority to compulsorily purchase land at existing use value and not at what it could be if you built really expensive flats on it. So what do you make of that? Firstly, I mean, this is not a new idea. People have been pushing for it, for example, to get into the Letwin report. And the Housing Select Committee, I know, has also called for this. But it's, how do you get it past the voters, especially the property owning voters? And do you think there's any appetite in the government for listening to that?
I can come in if you like. This conversation gets brought up fairly regularly, and I've been bringing it for a few years, in part to try to kind of test the waters to see what government thinks. Now, there hasn't been a frank and honest conversation about actually what it costs for a local authority to develop in comparison to a private developer. And I think that it'd be important to have those conversations and understand why CPO isn't working. Now, I would back that's a change to policy, but it's not translating well within the political sphere. And we've been fighting this effort for so long, and we've got haven't got very far at all. If we look at somewhere like Germany, where they do CPO and then they have zonal areas where they know what they're going to build, and then they get all the developers in at one time to try and help local and small developers deliver these homes, and they compete on quality. Actually, all that is part of a raft of strategy. Whereas what we're talking about is simply moving the system over. Now, while I agree with that, I don't think you're going to get it through government more easily. I think the better solution, I think this is something that I'm going to keep saying throughout, is to test the waters to understand why is it CPO isn't working. For example, I speak to Paul Smith every now and again, Cabinet Minister for Housing in Bristol. And it's very difficult. He does a really good job trying to get CPO through, but he struggles with actually getting things over the line. We need to understand why that is. And once we understand why that is, I think that will create new levers for people to say, actually, hold on, we do need better CPO powers. Unfortunately, what we have is we have almost two groups headbutting against each other. We must have CPO, or we're not sure about CPO. We need to unlock why CPO isn't working first in order to move that debate on. Otherwise, for the last 20 or 30 years, we've just been getting it wrong. And it's frustrating. We don't look into the politics of why something doesn't work, despite it being an idea that many people look at and go, that makes a lot of sense.
Yeah, I think I'd just add to that. I think if you look at how local authorities use CPOs, in my experience, it's always been a piecemeal, as a development comes forward or as and when needed. There's no a strategic approach to a site or a development is not really often taken. And I think if we're going to really talk about CPOs and changing the policy and the powers around CPOs, I think we need to actually even look at that model that Rico was talking about in Germany, about having a strategic approach, maybe even having a pilot zone about master planning a particular area. So there's certainty for developers, the residents, the council, the authorities, who else needs it, to actually see this is what the end game is, this is what the goals are going to be, and the outcome's going to be. And this is why CPO matters in this particular area. And I think if we master planning an area would actually enable that conversation to take place about what the benefits are going to be. And I think that's the difficulty within the political sphere about CPOs and the worries and the kind of headlines about, are you taking my land, my property, or that away? Actually, the conversation needs to be, what are the needs, what are the outcomes going to be needed, and what do we need to deliver, and how are the best routes to get there. And I think a master planning approach or a zonal approach would be a way to kind of show how CPOs can work better.
To me, the actual use of CPOs to compile land and build it, for example, a new public development, is actually just the tip of the iceberg. I think the main benefit of much easier, much more widespread CPO is all of the land that is not CPO'd. As I mentioned in my introduction, if you are a landowner, it may be agricultural land, it may be land used for something else that's far less profitable because it's far less desirable than its use as housing, but it doesn't get brought forward because they expect land values to just rise and rise, and so they hold on to it to get a higher value. If they knew that at any moment, even if it's unlikely, someone could come along and snap it up for what they're currently getting paid for it, which might not be very much, that would give them incentive to part with it at a much lower cost. And so developers, private and social, would be able to buy that on the open market at a lower value. That to me is its main benefit.
So I'd absolutely echo that. I've bear the scars on my back from campaigning on CPO reform for a number of years, and have had conversations with government about it. So hopefully I have some insight on the difficulties there. I absolutely support the use of CPO. I think it's a really valuable tool for public bodies like councils to have in their pocket. But for me, the problem is not that CPO itself is too difficult. The problem is the rules around CPO compensation have much broader impacts throughout the whole of the land market. So that mechanism that Reuben has described there, where land values tend to increase over time. We've had a 600% increase in land values over the last 20 years. Land now accounts for 51% of the UK's GDP, just land, not the buildings on top of it, just land. That situation, a really important driver of it is CPO compensation rules, because those compensation rules say that if a local authority does CPO land, it has to pay for it at a price that includes hope value, the value attendant on planning permissions that don't actually exist, haven't actually been given, but might one day in the future theoretically be given. Not wanting to introduce too much complexity here, you could also imagine how permitted development rights change that equation somewhat. We now have a situation where permitted development rights have given sort of broad liberties to convert commercial, industrial and other uses into residential with no planning permission. So it's clearly then going to be, there's a lot of opportunities for landowners to claim that in the absence of the CPO, they would have had permission to build residential. And that is a really important part of the mechanism that increases those land values. what it does is contribute to a grand wrong pricing of land in the UK. It encourages everybody to price their land as if it's going to be used for the most profitable possible use. But we know very well that we can't solve the housing crisis or do any of the things we need to do as a country by building only the most profitable kinds of homes. There are not 300,000 households ready, able and willing to buy market sale homes at current prices. We know we need to build other types of homes as well. But that CPO compensation rule, saying that compensation has to include home value, that sets a high bar for the way that land is priced throughout the market. And I think it's removing that barrier for me that holds out the real potential here. If we're using CPO to acquire land, that's great. But I think a much better, more sustainable situation is one where private land transactions can be used to build a whole range of homes. Not only, luxury flats or three-bedroom detached homes, but social rent homes, shared ownership, homes for older people, all the different kinds of building we need. And that won't happen all the time that we're pricing all of our land as if it's going to be used for one thing.
I just want to just come back a little bit on that. And while I do agree with you, I've spoken to quite a few landowners as part of my role. And for example, just outside Swindon, somebody offered a piece of land to the council for 120 social homes. Now they cannot get a conversation with the council to deliver them. They're offering that land, not at any hope value, just as land for social housing. The local authority is not interested. And I think that this is often misunderstood. And I think in part it's because we have a London planning policy and we have a rest of the England planning policy. So if we look, some of the homes with the largest waiting list for council homes are actually in those areas with the most green belt. This is a political issue as well. So I've always been very aware of the political issue here. So in my first year of my job, I tried to put this subdivision of large sites policy into government, and I convinced a few people to back me, and we got it in. We didn't really know how we were going to use it, but I thought CPO was a good way to utilise that, because the way we looked at it is perhaps self-build, SME, social housing association could have access to a piece of land that wasn't being delivered quickly enough, and the CPO could be used on a large site in order to get that little piece of land through and force a particular type of home on that site. And I know obviously I mentioned piecemeal earlier, and effectively that was a piecemeal approach because I had to put something in place knowing that in 5 years' time it may come up. But unless we know why these things aren't coming forward, politicians can't then back them. And we saw that a few weeks ago with the government backing planning powers being taken away from local authorities via Homes England. I think I was the only one in the industry. Actually, I know Reuben actually retweeted something I said that said, look, this makes sense. If we want to go back to the Allison Act, if we want to deliver those post-war houses, the only way we can do that is by starting to remove planning powers from local authorities that don't want to deliver them. And we can see exactly which councils are doing a good job and which ones aren't on social housing by how many homes they deliver every year and what they're planning for next year. Things will start to move now with the HRA cap, but we often ignore the central and the local politics in all this. And while yes, CPO rules should change, and I would back both of your campaigns, and I always have, we're not actually understanding exactly what the other barriers are to delivery. And unfortunately, that is the planning system. And part of that, I guess, is the Section 106 and the certainty, the private developer.
You are shaking your head. You have a minute to reply.
Yeah, I mean, I do agree. Planning system is not perfect by any means, sure. And I think there are different local authorities with different different views about how they're delivering housing. I would caution the approach of kind of the reforms that are being kind of talked about, simply because there is an element of democratic oversight and resident participation in the planning process. Imperfect as it is, I think there is a value to be had in terms of residents engaging in the planning process and the changes in the built environment around them. And don't get me wrong, we're a borough that build. We've got our own council house building program. We're building 1,000 in the next 2-3 years. But there is a question to be asked about, 9 out of 10 planning permissions are given. Why are so many homes not being built? There's land that's being given planning permission and houses aren't being built by developers, and that's a question that needs to be asked as well. So I think alongside reform, I'm not against complete reform, but I think there's an element of we have to also talk about local democracy and local resident participation in the planning process. I think that's really important.
So some questions from the audience. So we had someone saying more of a comment than a question, but the TfL sites now on the GLA small sites portal are not dedicated to 100% affordable. Of the five sites, 3 have half affordable and 2 sites have no mention of affordable. And that's an opportunity wasted to raise cash and not meet the housing need. Another person saying, very good to hear Rico talk about alternative approaches to planning reform, with the reminder that German and Dutch planning system is so much more than just a zonal approach to planning. The Dutch Vinex approach manages to balance greenfield sites, housing quality, delivery of housing targets, and land value capture, but is a long, slow, planned mechanism with a degree of enforced cooperation. And then there's another person saying, does the panel agree that the German existing use value is equivalent to development value because their planning system is almost entirely state-led? Would they agree that a change to a state-led planning system would be constitutionally necessary prerequisite to public acquisition at existing use value? So there's a lot here about how much should the state lead the planning system and change away from the level of discretion that we have at the moment. So what do you make of that?
Can I come back on existing use values? This is a particular sort of technical bugbear of mine. So Network Home's call for reform to the Land Compensation Act 1961 to allow public bodies to compulsory purchase land at existing use value. So that's the value of the land in its current use. If it's a field, then we're valuing it as a field. Now, I've looked at this in a lot of detail. I've come to the conclusion that reforming CPO to purchase at existing use value is legally highly problematic with the arrangement that we have in this country. The way that our own property laws interact with the European Convention on Human Rights makes it, nigh on impossible to do it that way. You can put CPO as existing use value, but the evidence bar for doing that is so high that I think it would be impossible to use it at scale. If we're talking about mechanisms to help us solve the housing crisis, that ain't it. What I do think we can do is reform the Land Compensation Act to remove the entitlement to hope value. So you just remove the entitlement to be compensated for your land as if it had a planning permission it doesn't actually have. And the effect is the same, to reduce the value of that compensation to something really close to existing use value. It's a technical point, but it's really important. I would say that in government, they are largely sold on the idea that at existing use value is not a goer, that it is not legally possible. Certainly that is the conclusion that Oliver Letwin's review came to. So, close to existing use value, removing hope value, I'd really say for anyone interested in this agenda and wanting to advance it, I'd really encourage you to think about using that language and avoiding at existing use value. We are not able to compulsory purchase land. We have to use a market value, right? The debate here is not do we pay market value or not, it's what does market value mean? Should market value include planning permissions that don't exist? In my view, no. There is no sense in doing that, and we know that it's causing enormous damage to our country and worsening the housing crisis by having it that way. We don't have to think about market value in that way. The market value of land could be the value of that land right now and the value of planning permissions it actually does have. And I think in that system we would see land values reduce really radically.
Consider me utterly convinced on that point.
Good. Well, let's move on to the next part of the report, which is about considering the social value and market value when selling public land. So, I have a question. So, have you seen an example of where this has been done, i.e. social value has been considered as well, and that has given a good outcome? Or if not, can you give a bad example of where it was not considered and therefore we had a bad outcome? So, I don't know if you've seen something in your borough, Shama, or any of the panelists have seen something practical to illustrate this?
Well, I can tell you how it's never used, and that's understanding who delivers and why. So if you look at something very small like what SMEs do for the marketplace, they train 7 in 10 construction apprentices. 90% of SMEs are the ones that do all the training. When you present that to a local authority as to why you might be a better developer or builder for that area, it's completely ignored. It's completely ignored that you supply the majority of the supply chain jobs, that you have a directly employed labour. It's ignored that you train to a higher level than other developers. This is part of the social use value. And actually, what's also ignored is what's being delivered on your site and how. So just as one example, you might be a developer delivering a site and you might want to put in cycle lanes, but you can't go and have a conversation with your council about that, to your local planning authority, to try and get that as part of the social value, because their strategy has already been set. So they say to you, well, stick on a couple of buses, and they'll run for 2 or 3 years. They might be empty for the whole time they're used because no one's using the buses, but that'll satisfy any mitigation we need on your site. We don't really have a strategy, and if we could have more social use, if we had more of a definition as to what that social value is, I think that we would have a much better approach. But the panelists might have a better understanding, especially Shama, of what's actually been delivered and perhaps what developers can do more to be part of that. Because, you know, when it comes to energy efficiency, and it's another great example. Our members are told by a local planning authority, can you deliver X amount of energy efficiency within your home? And they say, well, we can't really do that. And they say, look, we want this, we want that. So they stick it in. They don't do it to a passive house specification. They have passive house approaches because that's social value. And then the homes overheat or they have poor air quality. We don't have a strategy. And I would agree with the report, you know, if we could somehow define what social value is and what it can deliver, you know, Shama mentioned earlier, infrastructure, all those different things. They're the things that we really need to know, and that will guide developers, especially small developers who just want to win work, get on site, get off site, and then start a new project.
All of that's totally true, but the biggest and most tangible social value that you could give is literally charging sub-market rents for the homes. And that's something that developers, big or small, would want to minimise as much as possible. And that's why we need much more certainty on that point. And for me, social landlords, housing associations, councils themselves who want to build developments with the most homes that are the most affordable possible, that's something that should very easily just be one for one shaved off the market price that public bodies part with land for.
I think the social value question is massively important, and local authorities, you know, we are, you know, I want to build, we're building. But I think alongside that, we have to create places, we have to create communities, and the social value aspect alongside that, which good developers will bring alongside, is paramount to anything that we want to try and achieve. So housing in itself alone can't be the only end game of a development. We've got the opportunities now with the HRA cap lifted that actually, and obviously with our social procurement abilities within local authorities, to actually really drive forward some of those asks that we need to have to create that place and community. You know, there is no point having an estate bill or a housing bill if there are no other infrastructure facilities or social enablers to make that community a place. Otherwise, it just becomes repeated mistakes that we have done from previous decades. So I think I agree with Rico here that I think there's an element of local authorities working with developers, small or large, to facilitate actually not just supply chains and kind of the other social values and employment that comes with development, but actually what else do we as a local authority do we need? And I think that comes from master planning. I think London may be, you know, my view of the London plan and our local plan that we're currently going through, the inspector public examination, enables that to happen. So it gives certainty to developers about what we're expecting in terms of, and not just the housing element of it, but the social for housing and the cost of housing is in London particularly a real barrier for us. But I do agree that the social value aspect is, for me as a local authority, actually just as important as making sure that we deliver affordable homes, because those homes have to mean that you're creating life chances beyond just affordability of the house. So what else is it that we're enabling people to, and how they're living?
I would just point out that the Public Land for Housing programme, so that governs land held by central government, not these, but one of the main programmes we've had recently to get public land into use as housing. Over the last 10 years, we should have had just under 200,000 homes delivered through that route. That's how many were planned. Only 15% have actually been delivered on completed sites. That's how we're using public land right now. I mean, you know, the figures on how many social rent homes and how many affordable homes we're getting out of public land are pathetic. I think it's about 7% or something. But even the figures for building anything are absolutely awful. The good thing about that is I think it presents a really clear case for reform to government if there are good ideas out there for how to do it. I'm really pleased to see in Network Homes report the focus on best consideration rules and social value. I think that is the right place for us to be looking. In London, we have the expectation of 50% affordable housing in public land. I do think that's worked quite well for London because land values can support it, and having, you know, giving developers that certainty. All right, they might not like the number very much, but at least you know where you are. At least there's some certainty around that, and I think that has been effective in how metropolitan open land has been used in particular. But I don't think that blunt 50% affordable housing requirements for public land across the country are a good idea. So when I've looked at the development economics of some sites in the North and the Midlands in particular, if we do that, if we sort of place too much of a blunt expectation on public land, I think we will find some places struggling to deliver anything at all on it. And that to me is the bigger concern. We're not doing anything with our public land right now. It's sitting in developers' land banks. There's actually a really close relationship between public land sales and the growth of developers' land banks, strategic land banks that they sit on and do absolutely nothing with. That's what we're doing with our public assets at the moment. We're selling them to developers to sit on to make their balance sheets look better. There has to be a better way. I definitely think looking at social value is the right way of doing it. I think it has to be down to local actors ultimately to determine what can be delivered on public land and what's in the community's interests. I'd like to see more of a public discussion on this. You know, I think it's interesting that local communities don't sort of have more expectations of how public land is used. I think that could be a really fruitful area for us to look at and have that more collaborative approach between, you know, local landowners, NHS, local authorities and communities about what they want to see there.
There's a good question here from the audience. Sunita Ojala, sorry if I pronounce it incorrectly, asks, planning does not reward good design and social value in any tangible way. This allows developers to deliver to the lowest common denominator, which is their reward, in increased profits if they are allowed permissions based on poor design and poor social impact. How can we change this in planning policy to reward good design, adequately sized homes and good external environments? This was something that was in the Building Beautiful Commission's report as well. So what do you think? How can we reward social value in planning?
I will give one simple solution that all local authorities should consider. How are they using local development orders? How are they using their LDOs? Now, I've been going through many local authorities to find out how they're using LDOs. They just aren't. So if you look at very recently, we had the Future Home Standard where local authorities wanted individual control over what energy efficiency each home should deliver. Now, why not have an LDO to encourage better development and include design codes or code designs as part of that? Tell people what you want. I agree that's not perfect because we should have a better system throughout. But if you want to nudge the development industry closer to what you need, it's a good way to do it. There are many other mechanisms you can use, and representing the 99%, you know, the small developers. If you tell us what we want to deliver, and we know we can get on site more quickly, trust me, you will find developers that can do it. And we see that the poor use of policy is throughout the industry. If we look at the self-build register, I would argue self-build is a fantastic opportunity to deliver affordable homes that people want to own. But can you get a policy through in most local authorities? It's a nightmare. I've been on my self-build register for 3 years. They've delivered 0 homes. I've given them tons of suggestions. There are tons of small sites available, tons of garage opportunities. They're not interested. This is as much about politics as it is about policy. And I, Shama's there, and I the difficulty here is that this is a broad UK conversation, and London is its own difficult animal. I wrote a piece last week about racial inequality in the housing market, how actually it's going to be very difficult for people to become homeowners in London. Therefore, we must deliver more social homes. It's unquestionable. But because all conversations are about London, they don't translate very well to outside the region. And Rose mentioned it perfectly in the northeast, northwest. Yes, we want more affordable homes, but when you're delivering 3-bedroom semis for 120,000 and 4-bedroom detached for 220,000, and you've then got to deliver affordable homes at 30 to 40% on top of that, as a developer, you're pulling out your hair. And therefore, that pipeline, not land bank, suddenly has to be stretched because it's not deliverable. And I really wish that we could just be a bit more honest about how we've got regional challenges here. And then hopefully that would really help places like London, who have got the toughest challenges, to deliver something different.
Well, this is, I think, I completely concur here with Rico. I think the regional differences, so I speak to colleagues from other parts of the country about planning, about house building, and London, it is its own bubble. We have our own challenges here, and I don't think one size fits all in terms of any kind of planning policy. It can't work that way at all. If you look at the first homes policy that the government are pushing forward, we as London authorities wrote to CLG about actually, and to Generic about actually saying, this first home policy is not suitable in London. You've got to let us, it's another product that will enable developers to, 30% of market, 70% of market rate is not affordable in London still. But I can see that working for colleagues and other councils and authorities outside of London, particularly the Midlands and the North, where that first home policy can work. And I think there needs to be much more of a stronger regional approach to how we approach planning. And that seems to be something that's not really taken into account as much, and that's what's frustrating. And so I often get, well, you're London, all the money comes to London. I'm like, yeah, but we can't deliver as much social housing as we want. Affordable housing, shared ownership, still not affordable. 8% of market rate is still not affordable. So we need social housing. A London affordable rate enables that to happen, but actually there needs to be much more of a regional approach, and I don't think that's actually part of the conversation as much as it needs to be.
Right, well, that brings us to the next recommendation in the report, which is about section 106 and Cllr, to switch that to a flat tax on gross development value. So how would that work in a regional way? Maybe Reuben, can you answer? So what should this flat tax be, and would it vary across the country, given what Shama just put very well? London is very different too, up north and in the Midlands.
Exactly, it should vary from around the country, and even at local level around different boroughs. Centre for Cities put out a vaguely similar proposal that suggested a flat 20%, I think, throughout the country, but I don't think that will work, because housing, the need for sub-market rented homes or other affordable housing tenures is very different in one place to another, and also the viability concerns of building them are different from one place to another. So what we say in our report is councils should set out a plan for how many homes of which affordable tenures they need, and weigh that up against viability concerns to come up with what that flat tax should be themselves. And then the developers would pay that on a percentage of the gross development value. The way we make this ungameable, which is pretty clever, I would say that's we wrote the report, but the developers pay a flat tax on a value, on an amount of the gross development value that they predict when making their planning application. So if they say they're building 100 identical homes, and they submit a GDV of 20 million, averaging 200,000 per home, by the time they build this block, they pay that money to the local council, whatever the flat tax versus 20 million is. And then the council uses that money to buy the homes in the block. They could buy none and build their own land-led scheme somewhere else. They could buy up the whole block if they wanted, if the GDV was too low and the tax rate was too high, because the cost they'd pay for the homes in the block is determined by that value. So they'd pay £200,000 a home, regardless of what the true market value is. We think that would make councils have a lot more flexibility over where and how to build or acquire the housing they need. And it would also give developers total certainty, because they would effectively decide the amount of tax they pay based on what makes the scheme viable. So it's a way to definitely increase certainty for developers and more affordable homes.
Rose, would that work? You've looked into this a lot.
I definitely think it's a really interesting proposal in terms of, there's a massive drive now to get more certainty in the planning system. And I would say to anyone who cares about social rent housing and affordable housing, it's time for us to think about how we can make social housing and affordable housing part of that certainty as we think about how to move towards a more certain planning system. I don't think it's viable to sort of say, look, let's just do it like we did in the 1960s. So I really, really welcome an attempt to sort of engage with this really, really tricky topic. I do have a few queries though. So one thing I'm wondering about is how this interacts with the broader planning system we've got, and in particular the system of 5-year land supply and housing delivery test, which puts enormous pressure on councils to get numbers of homes delivered. Now, of course, their powers for getting numbers of homes delivered can be pretty limited. They can give out planning permissions that they can't make developers build, but that creates a lot of pressure in the system. And for me, it's really radically altered the balance of power between developers and local authorities. And I have some concerns about how this proposal would work within that system. I think the intention may be to have this as the way that we provide affordable housing within a completely new, different, reformed planning system. But sort of thinking about how it works with the system we've got, my concern is, what happens if a developer turns around and says, look, if you buy a number of affordable homes at the price that we agreed at the beginning, this scheme then becomes unviable and we're not going to deliver it. And you're then in a situation where you've got a stalled site in your hands, and as a local authority, if you've got government breathing down your neck to deliver those housing numbers to satisfy your housing delivery test, you might well find yourself in a situation where you've accepted the lower tax from the developer in return for lower priced affordable homes, but you find yourself unable to actually practice your side of the bargain because actually the developer has an awful lot more power in this system than the local authority does. And the other point I'd raise is my point right from the beginning, that all homes are not equal, and we actually have different standards for quality and space standards in social rent than we do for market sale. So actually some of the homes that were bought for social housing from the market after the last financial crash could not be used for social rent housing. They weren't large enough, they weren't the right kinds of homes. Even sort of beyond that regulatory concern, I'd also flag that the leading driver of poorer outcomes from our housing system for BAME groups is the lack of larger homes. So if we're talking about a situation where developers get to decide exactly what they're building, what size of homes, all the rest of it, and local authorities just have the right to purchase some of them at the end of the process, there's really not great prospects for increasing our control over this system, for saying, look, what we need is some 5-bedroom homes in this area, and that's what we're going to get. So I worry about the balance of power. But I'm really interested in it, and I think it's a really good, I really welcome it as an intervention in how you get affordable housing as part of certainty. So, I don't want to discourage you for one moment. I think it's a really welcome contribution, and I think we could probably work through these problems.
On your last point about the homes not necessarily meeting the standards, I mean, that's where the flexibility of the councils come in, because of course they don't need to buy any. And to address your first point too, the developer will be paying the same amount of tax regardless of what the local authority does. It shouldn't care whether the local authority buys up all of its homes or none of its homes, because either way, it's paying the same amount to them. So it shouldn't make the development any more or less viable because the local authority does or doesn't want to do that.
Very quickly, I found when I looked at viability that the thing actually that developers were most concerned about was being able to sell as many homes as market sale as possible. That's what they really wanted. Every home that wasn't going to be sold as market sale was a missed opportunity. And I sort of think that probably going into these developments, developers would want to know how many they're going to get to sell. And the answer to that question will affect that scheme's profitability.
But the councils will be paying a market value.
They're paying a value which the developer has determined for themselves.
I suppose I completely support the notion that we need to kind of look at look at this whole question, and I do agree with the idea of certainty within the system about securing socially affordable homes. My only concern with this would really be is that power angle in terms of, well, if we get to a point where the council won't buy off that particular site and is given cash for money for sites off on another development, it actually detracts from, I think, what a lot of councils' ambitions are around mixed developments, mixed communities, but also about actually in places like Brent, we are landlocked in terms of how much land we actually have to be able to build on. So I would rather see certainty within a particular development and getting social affordable homes in that scheme, rather than saying to us, actually giving us cash off site for building elsewhere, because I don't think that's something that actually is always tenable. I'd also like to see conversations about the right to buy receipts. You know, actually that needs to be part of the conversation about how we're funding socially affordable homes, and the government aren't really talking about that at the moment. And so there I think there's a talk about how we fund socially affordable homes. I'm not certain allowing developers to pay for housing off-site is the way to go. I think there needs to be certainty on the development created within a particular scheme.
We have time for one more question and then we have to wrap up. So,
can I just come in very quickly there? Sorry, I'll be very quick.
Half a minute.
Yeah, okay, Reuben, brilliant. Yeah, you know how I feel about CIL and certainty. CIL was meant to be introduced to remove Section 106 so we could have guaranteed knowledge on the land prices and it'll drop them. But two things to say. I know developers have been waiting 7 years to get planning, and they initially offered 50% affordable housing. Now it's at 20%, and it will go down to 10% because they still haven't got planning. I know other developers that want to offer starter homes, originally starter homes for much lower values, but they cannot get the local authority to agree to the planning because planning is allocated by the local authority in the local plan. If you don't allocate the right homes, you allocate the wrong permissions, you grant the wrong permissions, they will not be delivered in time because it's holding on lots of other issues. So they're the things that we need to tackle if we want the right homes. Tell us what you want. If you want 5-bedroom homes, you want 4-bedroom homes, tell us. They will be delivered if we can get planning on more quickly.
So there's a very good question here. How would a flat tax really differ from a flat percentage requirement? Would legitimate viability concerns really disappear? Wouldn't this lead to councils only buying affordable units in less valuable locations and therefore leading to social exclusion? Reuben?
To me, the difference would just be that, exactly as Rose and others have said, if part of a block is not suitable for social housing, the council has the option to take that money and build elsewhere, where it also might not only be better housing, but also a more suitable location. And also, I think on smaller schemes, having a fixed percentage of homes in the block for use of affordable housing just might not work from a management point of view if you have very spaced out social housing stock.
So, Rose, do you have a final comment on that?
I don't know, there's just such a lot going on. I suppose one other thing I'd say is that I think a really positive development from recent years is that some local authorities have had nuanced policies even within their local authority area. So we see this increasingly now. You know, Leeds has 4 different rates. It has a lower level of affordable housing required in regeneration areas and a higher level in more prosperous areas. I'd just say that I think that's been a really positive development. I think it's demonstrably increased the amount of affordable housing delivered, and we shouldn't lose that in any attempt to sort of simplify and get more certainty into the system.
Well, on that note, thank you very much to all of our speakers. This session has been recorded and it will be available to view and to share on the Network Homes website, possibly with Dominic Cummings. So please use the hashtag #MakingLandDeliver. And let's hope that there will be more certainty in the planning policy paper coming out soon. So thank you very much for joining us.
Thanks, Martina. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you,
guys.